The moment Benjamin Ashford rode into Caldwell, Kansas on the 14th of April, 1878, with nothing but a saddlebag half full of hardtack, a rifle he'd won in a card game, and the specific and deliberate intention of owing no man a single thing, a red-haired woman threw a cast-iron skillet at the head of the town sheriff. And Benjamin decided then and there that whatever this territory had in store for him, it was not going to be quiet. He pulled his roan mare to a stop outside the Caldwell General Mercantile and watched from beneath the brim of his dust-coated hat as the skillet clattered off the wooden awning of the sheriff's office and landed in the mud with a satisfying thud. The sheriff, a thick-necked man named Dale Prout who wore his badge like it was the only thing keeping his chest from caving in, stumbled back against his own door and sputtered something profane. The red-haired woman stood in the middle of the road, with her hands balled at her sides, and her jaw set so hard Benjamin could see the muscle jumping in her cheek from 20 feet away. "You come back to my land with another one of your writs, Dale Prout, and the next thing I throw will be considerably heavier," she said, and her voice carried the particular kind of calm that only existed on the far side of genuine fury. Prout smoothed his shirt and tried to recover what little dignity the mud-spattered brim of his own hat still afforded him. "Rosa Whitfield, that is interference with an officer of the law, and I can have you hauled in for it." "Then haul me in," Rosa Whitfield said. "And while you're explaining to Judge Harmon why you've arrested a widow woman for defending property that belonged to her husband and now belongs to her, I'll be explaining to him how many times you've let Calloway's men water their cattle on my well without my permission." Prout's face went through several complicated colors before he settled on a sort of mottled red that suggested he was doing a great deal of internal arithmetic and not liking any of the sums. He snatched his hat from the boardwalk, jammed it on his head, and walked away without another word, his boots squelching in the April mud. Benjamin watched Rosa Whitfield watch him go. She didn't move until Prout had rounded the corner at the far end of the street. Then her shoulders dropped exactly 1 inch, and she reached up and pressed the back of her hand to her temple, as though she had a headache that had been waiting patiently for the confrontation to finish before announcing itself. She was 24 years old if she was a day, and she carried herself like someone who had been told repeatedly by the world that it did not intend to make things easy for her, and who had responded to that information by developing a comprehensive set of contingency plans. Benjamin climbed down from his mare, tied her to the post outside the mercantile, and told himself firmly that whatever the situation was between the red-haired woman and the badge-wearing man, it was not his business. He was not going to make it his business. And if he'd learned one thing in the 26 years he'd spent navigating a world that had a habit of presenting problems that were not his, and then somehow making them his anyway, it was that keeping your head down and your debts clean was the only way a man got to stay his own person. He went into the mercantile and bought flour, a tin of coffee, 2 boxes of rifle ammunition, and a small bag of dried apples, and he paid for all of it in coin, because he did not buy on credit, not ever, not since the autumn of 1874 when his father had died owing 3 men money, and the weight of that had fallen across Benjamin's shoulders like something physical, something he'd had to learn to breathe around. He had ridden out of Missouri the following spring with the specific intention of making himself a man who owed nothing, expected nothing, and was therefore surprised by nothing. Kansas had seemed like a reasonable place to start. He was loading his saddlebag on the boardwalk when he heard boots on the planking behind him, and he turned to find Rosa Whitfield standing 3 feet away with the skillet recovered and hanging from one hand and a look on her face that was somewhere between evaluation and decision. "You're new," she said. "Passing through," he said. "Where to?" "Not anywhere particular." He cinched the saddlebag. "Just not here." She tilted her head slightly, the way a hawk tilts its head when something moves below it. "You have a name, Benjamin Ashford. Rosa Whitfield." She didn't extend her hand, which he respected because it was honest. She was looking at him the way people look at things they are trying to decide whether to trust, and he got the feeling she'd been burned enough times by that particular exercise that she'd become very methodical about it. "You looking for work?" "I'm not looking for anything that comes with obligations attached." She smiled at that, and it was not the kind of smile that meant she found it funny. It was the kind of smile that meant she understood exactly what he meant because she had once felt the same way, and she had learned that the world did not care very much what conditions you set for it. "Obligations," she said. "Right. Well, my fence needs mending on the east quarter. I pay a fair wage daily in cash. You're done when you're done, and you're free to go wherever not anywhere particular is." Benjamin looked at her for a moment. He looked at the skillet and the mud still drying on the hem of her dress and the particular way she held herself upright, and he said, "I'll look at the fence." He told himself it was because he needed the money, which was true. He did not tell himself the other thing, which was also starting to be true, because he had only been in Caldwell for 20 minutes, and that would have been embarrassing. The Whitfield land was 3 miles east of town, and it was good land. Benjamin could see that the moment they crested the low rise and the property opened up below them, a stretch of Kansas plain that rolled gently toward a creek line shaded by cottonwoods, with a solid-built farmhouse and a barn that needed some roof work but was otherwise sound, and a well in the yard that looked clean and deep. There were 40 head of cattle grazing the south pasture, solid animals, and the fields showed signs of a woman who worked hard and worked smart. What the land also showed were signs of a woman being slowly squeezed. 3 sections of fence on the east border had been cut and badly restrung, the kind of repair that had been done in a hurry and not by someone who knew what they were doing. The gate to the south pasture had been broken off its upper hinge and then reattached with a piece of rope that would last another week at most. A corner post on the north line had been pulled entirely from the ground and then shoved back in without being properly set. Benjamin stood at that north corner post and pushed it with 2 fingers, and it rocked. He looked at Rosa Whitfield. "Callaway," she said simply. "Thomas Callaway owns the land to the east and north. He's been wanting to add my acreage to his operation since before my husband died. He made an offer last year. I said no." She paused. "He's been making his dissatisfaction known in small ways ever since." "These aren't small ways," Benjamin said. "No," she agreed. "They're getting less small. And the sheriff, Prout, works for whatever side of any question Callaway is on." She said it matter-of-factly, without heat, the way you describe weather. "The writ he brought this morning was a nuisance suit, claiming I owe a water easement fee to Callaway for my own creek water, because there's apparently a paper filed in Wichita that says the creek is split ownership. My lawyer in Wichita says it's a fabrication, but proving fabrication takes time and money, and Callaway knows that." Benjamin looked out across the property. He looked at the fence line, and he looked at the cattle, and he looked at the farmhouse, and the woman standing beside him with the skillet still hanging from one hand because she'd brought it from town without thinking about it and hadn't yet gone back to set it down. And he thought, very carefully and very deliberately, that this was not his problem. Then he said, "You'll need a new corner post. Good cedar, 4 inches square and at least 5 feet long. You got any cut?" Something shifted in her expression. Something small and cautious, like a window being opened 1 inch to test the air. "There's a stack behind the barn," she said. He spent the afternoon resetting the north corner post and remending 2 sections of fence, and Rosa Whitfield brought him water twice and did not hover, which he appreciated. The hired hand she'd had since autumn, a quiet older man named Amos who walked with a permanent list to one side from an old break that hadn't healed right, helped with the heavier post work and filled in some of the history while they worked. Amos had been with the Whitfields since before Rosa's husband, a man named Thomas Whitfield, had died of pneumonia the previous October. Thomas Whitfield, as described by Amos with the charitable imprecision of a man who had liked someone but was not going to pretend the situation was simple, had been a good man and a bad businessman, the kind of combination that works fine in a good year and becomes a slow catastrophe in any other kind. He'd borrowed against the property twice, once for equipment and once for reasons Amos did not specify, and Rosa had spent the past 6 months clearing those debts and keeping the operation functional and fighting off Calloway's encroachment on all fronts simultaneously. "She's got spine enough for 3 people," Amos said, driving a fence staple with 3 measured swings of his hammer. "And she's smart about it, but there's only so much one woman and an old man with a busted hip can do." "I'm just fixing the fence," Benjamin said. "Sure," said Amos, and did not say anything else. Benjamin stayed for 3 days, which he had not intended to do, but the roof of the barn needed patching before the next rain or Rosa would lose a quarter of her hay storage, and once he'd started on that it made no sense to leave before he finished. He slept in the barn, ate supper at the farmhouse table, and paid careful and consistent attention to the business of not getting involved in anything that did not pertain to the specific physical repair work he was doing. Rosa cooked well and talked carefully, which meant she said a great deal about practical things and very little about personal ones. She asked him about his route west, about conditions in Missouri, and whether the drought reports she'd heard were accurate, about what he thought of Kansas so far, and she listened to his answers with the attentiveness of someone filing information away because information had value. She did not ask why he was alone or what he was running from, partly because she had the manners not to and partly because she could probably see from looking at him that the answer was not simple and that he would not give it even if she asked. On the 3rd evening they sat on the porch after supper, and the sun went down in the particular explosive way it went down in Kansas, as though it was trying to make a statement, and Rosa held a cup of coffee in both hands and looked out at her land and said, "My husband borrowed against this property for cattle he didn't buy. I don't know what he did with the money. I found out 6 months after he was buried." Benjamin was quiet. "I'm not telling you that for sympathy," she said. "I'm telling you because you've been careful for 3 days not to ask me anything about myself, which is kind, but also means you're operating with an incomplete picture of what kind of situation you've been doing carpentry in the middle of, and I'd rather you know." "Why?" he said. She looked at him sideways. "Because I'd like to ask you to stay on through the planting season. I can pay you $40 a month plus room and board. Amos and I can't manage the east field alone, and if I don't get that field in by May, I lose the whole growing season, and by September, I won't have the cash to carry through winter." Benjamin looked at the sunset. He thought about not anywhere particular and about the specific and principled freedom of a man who owed nothing. He thought about the corner post he'd set, which was solid and would last 20 years, and about the barn roof that would now keep the rain out, and about the fence line that was straight and clean for the first time in months. "$40 a month is fair," he said. She nodded once briskly. "I'll make up the room off the kitchen. It's warmer than the barn." He moved into the room off the kitchen on the 4th day. He told himself he was doing it for the money. The first week of work was establishing patterns. Benjamin was up before the sun, which he discovered was about the same time Rosa was up, and the two of them had developed a wordless morning choreography within 4 days that involved him taking the water from the kitchen pump to the stock while she started the stove, and then coming back to eat and trade off on the morning tasks with the practical efficiency of people who had both spent their adult lives doing large amounts of work with minimal assistance. Amos arrived mid-morning each day and stayed until his hip gave out, which was usually around 3 in the afternoon, and he did the work that could be done sitting or leaning, and occasionally the work that couldn't be done sitting or leaning, because he had not yet fully accepted the terms of his hip's surrender. Calloway's men rode the fence line twice that first week, which Benjamin observed from a distance both times and noted without comment. The second time, one of the riders cut a strand of wire on the north quarter and then rode away without looking back. Benjamin repaired the wire the same afternoon and said nothing to Rosa about what had caused it, which turned out to be unnecessary because Rosa had seen it from the kitchen window. "He's testing," she said that evening at supper. "Seeing if I notice, seeing if I respond." "What do you want to do about it?" Benjamin asked. She looked at him across the table, surprised, as though she had expected advice or instructions and had gotten a question instead. "I want to document it," she said after a moment. "Every cut wire, every damaged post, every encroachment. Date and time and description. If I can build a record of consistent interference, I have something to take to the circuit judge when he comes through in June." "That's smart," Benjamin said. She looked at him again with that slight tilt of the head. "You don't need to sound surprised," she said mildly. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm agreeing." "Men around here tend to say things like that in a particular tone," she said. "I'm not from around here." She looked at him for a moment, and then she almost smiled, which was different from the thin, defensive smiles she distributed when she was managing a situation, and was instead the kind of expression that arrives when a person is caught off guard by something that pleases them. She looked back at her plate. "No," she said. "I suppose you're not." He started keeping the documentation log that night, in his own handwriting, because his hand was steadier than Rosa's for sustained writing. She'd spent too many mornings in cold weather, and her fingers gave her trouble. She dictated, he wrote, and they built a record that was exact and clear, with the careful specificity of people who understood that precision in documentation was the difference between a claim and a proven fact. They worked side by side in the east field the following week, breaking the late spring ground for corn, and Benjamin discovered that Rosa Whitfield had opinions about everything, and was not in the habit of keeping them to herself when the topic was something she knew, which was a great many things. She knew the soil composition of her land quarter by quarter. She knew the watershed behavior of the creek in heavy rain. She knew which of the cattle were prone to fence walking, and which of Callaway's boundary markers were actually 6 inches into her land. She knew the migration patterns of the prairie birds, and she used them to predict weather, and she was right about it more often than not. She also, he discovered, had a way of asking questions that were not actually questions but were invitations to talk, constructed with such care that you answered them before you'd fully noticed she'd asked. It was the 3rd week before he caught himself having told her about his mother, who'd been the daughter of a schoolteacher in St. Louis, and about his father, who'd been a good farmer but a man with a weakness for other people's promises, and about the 2 years he'd spent working for a cattle outfit in Missouri after his father died, paying off the debts one by one, while the foreman watched him with the particular expression of a man who finds other people's honor somewhat baffling. "You paid them all?" Rosa asked. She was mending a harness on the porch, and the afternoon was warm enough that she'd pushed her sleeves up to her elbows. "Every one," Benjamin said, "took 2 years, and then you left." The day the last one was settled, he looked at the horizon, rode west the next morning. She was quiet for a moment, working the heavy needle through the leather with practiced precision. "My husband's debts," she said. "I paid those too, what I could. Some of the men he owed were reasonable, one wasn't." "Which one?" "A man named Garfield Crane. He lent Thomas money at terms that were essentially criminal and then added fees when Thomas died before he could pay it back. I spent most of the winter arguing with him through letters and finally got the amount down to something I could actually clear." She set the harness piece down on her lap. "I paid him in February, every penny. I walked into his office in Wichita and put the money on his desk in cash and watched him count it. And when he finished and looked up, I told him that if I ever heard his name again in connection with my property, I would go to the newspaper in Wichita and give them a very detailed account of his lending practices." Benjamin looked at her. "Did that work?" "He's been very quiet since," she said, and picked up the harness again. He started laughing before he could stop himself. And it was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and it surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her, because she looked up at him with those clear hazel eyes, and the expression on her face was a kind of open delight that she hadn't had time to put a wall around before he saw it, And then she was laughing too. And the two of them sat on the porch in the warm April afternoon and laughed together like people who had both been serious for so long they'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have the particular muscles for it. The laughter settled into something easier between them after that, a loosening of the careful distance they'd both been maintaining with the dedicated effort of people who know what they're doing and why. They still worked with the same practical efficiency. They still kept their relationship squarely in the category of professional arrangement. But the air between them had changed composition slightly, the way air changes before rain, charged and expectant without anything having happened yet. Thomas Calloway made his presence felt more concretely at the end of the third week. He was not a man who came himself, which Benjamin had already surmised from the nature of the fence interference. Calloway was the kind of man who had people, and who kept himself at sufficient remove from his own decisions that plausible deniability was always close at hand. He was 52 years old, Benjamin learned from Amos, and had built his ranch operation by strategic acquisition, which in practical terms meant he'd waited for neighbors to struggle, and then bought them out at prices that were technically voluntary and essentially coercive. He had 3,000 acres and he wanted more, and Rosa Whitfield's section sat between two portions of his land like the last piece of a puzzle, and he'd been waiting for the widow woman to break under the accumulated weight of everything he could pile on her without technically crossing a line. What he did at the end of the third week was send his foreman, a lean, weathered man named Boggs, to the Whitfield property with a new offer. 40 cents on the dollar of assessed value, take it or leave it, and if she left it, Boggs was instructed to make clear, things were likely to become considerably more difficult. Benjamin was working on the barn roof when Boggs arrived, and he watched from up there as Rosa came out of the house and stood in the yard and listened to what Boggs had to say. He watched her face during the conversation. She did not change expression once. When Boggs finished talking, she said something that Benjamin couldn't hear from the roof, and Boggs's jaw tightened, and then Rosa turned and walked back into the house, and Boggs stood in the yard for a moment looking at the house, and then looked up at Benjamin on the roof, and Benjamin met his eyes with the specific absence of expression that is itself a message, and Boggs turned his horse and rode out. Rosa came out the back door a few minutes later with a cup of coffee. She held it up toward the roof. "You want some? Bring it up," he said. She climbed the ladder with the cup in one hand with the ease of a person who'd climbed ladders while carrying things many times before, and she sat on the roof beside him and handed him the coffee, and they both looked at the road where the dust of Boggs's departure was still settling. "He offered me 40 cents on the dollar," she said. "I heard about what 40 cents on the dollar means," he said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him," she said carefully, "that Mr. Calloway's figure suggested he was either very poor at arithmetic or very optimistic about my desperation, and that I'd be writing to my lawyer in Wichita this evening." Benjamin drank the coffee. It was good coffee, strong and not bitter, which Rosa achieved through some alchemy of method he hadn't identified yet. "Your lawyer," he said. "Is he any good?" "He's the best I can afford," which puts him somewhere in the middle. She was quiet for a moment. "There's a lawyer in Wichita named Marcus Porter who handled a similar dispute 2 years ago for a family named Hutchins. He got them a fair settlement from a railroad that was trying to acquire their land by similar means. He's expensive." "How expensive?" She named a figure, and Benjamin worked out the arithmetic and said, "If the East Field comes in well in July, you'd be close." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about my finances." "I've been thinking about the situation," he said, which was true and also not the whole truth, because the situation included her, and she was harder to stop thinking about than he'd accounted for, and this was becoming more of a problem with each day that passed. She was looking at him with that direct, measuring look, and he got the feeling that she was thinking about more than the situation too, because the Rosa Whitfield he'd come to know over 3 weeks was not a woman who did not notice things. She noticed everything. She simply chose with enormous precision what to do with what she noticed. "Benjamin," she said, Yes, she seemed to be choosing something. When you came to Caldwell, you said you weren't looking for anything with obligations attached. That's right. Has that changed? He looked at the field spread out below the barn roof, the east section barely broken, the south pasture green and good, the creek line glinting through the cottonwoods in the afternoon light. He thought about the corner post and the fence and the documentation log and 46 mornings of starting the fire, and how the coffee was always good. He thought about laughter on the porch. Something's changing, he said. I'm still working out what to do with that. Rosa Whitfield nodded once, with the particularity of a woman receiving accurate information. She climbed back down the ladder with her empty cup and went back to what she'd been doing. And Benjamin stayed on the roof in the warming late April sun and thought, with considerable exasperation directed primarily at himself, that he'd ridden into this territory with nothing owed and nothing expected, and had managed to accumulate both in under a month. The circuit judge came to Caldwell on the 5th of May, 6 weeks ahead of his usual June schedule due to a reshuffled docket, and Rosa got word from her Wichita lawyer on a Wednesday that the water easement case Calloway had filed was going to be heard on Friday, which meant 2 days to prepare for something she'd expected to have 6 more weeks to prepare for. Benjamin drove the buggy to Wichita on Thursday, a full day's hard drive, with Rosa beside him and the documentation log in a leather satchel between them, and they stayed overnight at a boarding house because there was no way to make the drive there and back in a day, and Rosa paid for 2 rooms and was precise about it. And Benjamin didn't argue, because she had a great deal to prove to herself about the conditions of things, and he understood that and respected it. She met with her lawyer that evening, a young man named Aldridge who was earnest and knowledgeable and clearly working very hard in a suit that had seen better days, and she spread the documentation log out on his office table and went through it entry by entry, and Aldridge said, "This is very thorough," in a tone that suggested he had not expected it to be. "Mr. Ashford helped me keep it," Rosa said. Aldridge looked at Benjamin over his spectacles. "And you witnessed the incidents described?" "Most of them," Benjamin said. "The ones from April 14th on. Before that is Mrs. Whitfield's direct testimony." "Which is admissible," Aldridge said, making notes. "Good. This is better than I expected, Mrs. Whitfield. The fabricated easement claim is thin. Calloway's attorney knows it's thin, which is probably why they scheduled it early, hoping to catch you unprepared." "We're prepared," Rosa said. Aldridge looked at her and then at Benjamin and then back at his notes, and the expression on his face was the small, restrained smile of a man watching something work out that he'd half expected not to. The hearing was in the county courthouse in Wichita, a 2-story brick building that smelled of paper and permanence, and Judge Harmon was a compact gray-haired man who wore his authority quietly and asked very precise questions, and had no patience for anything that wasted his time. Calloway's attorney, a tall man named Severance who had the polished ease of a man who billed by the hour and enjoyed it, presented the easement claim with considerable flourish, and what turned out to be a document that was, when Aldridge examined the court record from which it allegedly derived, dated with a stamp from 2 years before a recording system that used that stamp had been implemented. Judge Harmon spent 45 seconds looking at the document, then he looked at Severance. "This stamp format was adopted by the county recording office in January of 1876, he said. "Your Honor, the date on this document is March of 1874, the judge said. There was a silence in the courtroom. "I see," said Severance, and the polish came off him all at once, like the silver rubbing off a cheap coin. Judge Harmon dismissed the easement claim with prejudice, which meant Calloway couldn't bring it again, and he flagged the fraudulent document for investigation by the county attorney, which meant Calloway's problems were about to become significantly larger than they'd been before he decided to manufacture paperwork. Calloway himself wasn't in the courtroom. He was never in the courtroom. He was always somewhere else, at sufficient remove, plausibly ignorant. But this time, the remove was not going to be sufficient, because a document that had been filed with his attorney and bore his interests was a document that led back. Rosa walked out of the courthouse into the May sunshine and stood on the steps and breathed in a way that Benjamin recognized as the release of something that had been held for a very long time. He stood beside her and didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said yet. Then she turned to him and her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't quite tears but was adjacent to them, the brightness of a person who has been under enormous pressure and has just felt it lift, and she said, "Thank you. For the log. For driving me here, for all of it. You won it," he said. "I just wrote things down." "You wrote things down every evening for 6 weeks at a kitchen table because my handwriting hurts my fingers. And you drove a full day in a buggy without complaining. And you've been mending my fence and fixing my barn and planting my east field. And I'd like you to know that I am aware of all of that." She paused. "And I'd like you to know that I would like you to stop thinking of yourself as a man who is temporarily in a place, and start thinking of yourself as a man who might consider being somewhere for a while." Benjamin looked at her on the courthouse steps in the Wichita sunshine, with her red hair coming loose from its pins in the wind and her chin up and her eyes clear, and he felt something in his chest execute a movement that was not comfortable and not unwelcome, a shifting of something that had been very deliberately fixed in place, moving of its own will toward something new. "That's as close to asking as you're going to get, isn't it?" he said. She smiled, and it was the real smile, the unguarded one he'd first seen on the porch. "It's very close," she said. "I'll think about it," he said. She rolled her eyes, which was the first time she'd done that, and it was the best thing he'd seen in months, and she walked down the courthouse steps toward the street and he followed her. And in the afternoon light of Wichita, he made a decision that he did not yet announce but felt settle through him with the weight of a corner post being properly set. The drive back to Caldwell the next day was easier than the drive there, the way things are easier when you know how they resolve. They talked more freely, the careful professional register they'd maintained softening into something that had more room in it, more air. She told him about growing up in Missouri, near enough to where he'd grown up that they'd shared weather and not known it, her father a doctor who died when she was 16, her mother remarrying a man in St. Louis, Rosa choosing not to go with them but to stay with her aunt in the county she knew. She'd married Thomas Whitfield at 19, which she said without inflection, and moved to Kansas at 21 and had been here since. "Did you love him?" Benjamin asked, and then immediately thought perhaps that was too direct. But Rosa didn't seem to find it too direct. She thought about it for a moment with the honest deliberateness she brought to everything. "I loved who I thought he was when I married him," she said. "I loved him less as I came to understand him better. By the time he died, I'd settled into something more like," she searched for the word, "loyalty. I think that's the honest answer. I was loyal to him because I'd said I would be and because I'm not a person who goes back on things I've said." "No," Benjamin agreed. "You're not." She looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, watching the Kansas plane roll past. "And you," she said, "have you ever come close to anything like that?" "No," he said. "I kept moving." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because I thought freedom was the same thing as not being attached to anything. That if you didn't owe anyone and didn't expect anything, you couldn't be trapped." He paused. "I'm revising that assessment." She looked at him with those hazel eyes, serious and warm together, the way light can be serious and warm. "What are you revising it to?" "I'm working on the language," he said. She let that stand, which was the right thing to do, and they drove the rest of the way to Caldwell in a silence that was not empty but was full of things that were finding their form. He asked her to walk with him along the creek line that evening, after they were back and the animals were tended and Amos had gone home. The cottonwoods were leafed out and the creek was running clear and fast with the spring melt, and the light was going gold and long across the water. "Rosa," he said. "Yes," she said, which was both answer and patience. "I came here with the specific intention of not owing anyone anything." And I've spent the last month mending fences and filing legal documents and learning how you prefer your coffee, and being shown by your land and your conduct, and your company that the conditions I set for myself were." He stopped, looking for the right word again. "Wrong," she said quietly. "Insufficient," he said. "They didn't account for the possibility that there was someone who could make the owing and the expecting feel like something I wanted rather than something I was afraid of." He looked at her. "I'm not good at this part. I'm much better at fixing things." "You're doing well," she said, and her voice was gentle in a way it hadn't been before, because she'd been careful with him and careful with herself, and they'd both been so careful, and now here they were by the creek in the gold light. "I'd like to stay," he said, "not as a hired man. As a man who is staying because he wants to be here and not because the terms of employment require it." She was standing very close to him, close enough that he could see the creek light in her eyes, and she said, "The terms of employment were always somewhat pretextual from my side as well." "Were they?" he said. "The fence could have waited another week," she said. "I asked you because I wanted to." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and her hand was warm and rough at the palm from work and light at the fingers, and he held it with the specific care of something that matters, and she turned her hand to hold his back. He kissed her by the creek as the last light went, and it was not a tentative kiss because neither of them was a tentative person. It was the kiss of two people who had been honest with themselves and each other about what was happening, and had decided with full deliberateness to let it be what it was. She pressed her hand against his chest, and he held her face with one hand, and the cottonwood leaves moved over them in the evening air, and when they stepped back there was nothing left of the careful professional distance, and neither of them had any interest in reconstructing it. "Well," Rosa said. Her voice was slightly different, lighter in some quality. "Well," Benjamin agreed. They walked back to the house holding hands in the dark, and Amos, who arrived for morning work the next day and found them eating breakfast with an air of settled happiness that had not been there the previous day, looked at his coffee cup and said, "About time," and nobody contradicted him. Calloway's situation deteriorated through May and into June. The county attorney's investigation into the fabricated easement document moved forward with the unhurried certainty of a large stone rolling downhill. And in mid-May, two of Calloway's own ranch hands came forward to a county magistrate with accounts of being asked to alter records and interfere with neighboring property, motivated primarily by Calloway's response to the courthouse loss, which had apparently involved a great deal of shouting and an instruction to escalate. Which instruction the hands had decided they were not willing to carry out. Prout, reading the direction of events with the instincts of a man who has always known which side of a question to be on, and understood that the arithmetic had changed, quietly ceased any assistance to Calloway's interests, and just as quietly began responding to complaints from Rosa's property with the promptness and thoroughness he'd been withholding for the past year. Benjamin rode with Rosa to the circuit court in early June, where Judge Harmon, returned for his regular session, heard the full documentation of interference, and ruled in Rosa's favor on all outstanding boundary questions, ordering Calloway to pay restoration costs for damaged fence and well interference, and issuing a formal injunction against further encroachment. Calloway did not attend that hearing either. His attorney Severance attended, looking considerably less polished than he had in May, and offered no effective rebuttal to the documented record of 63 separate incidents of fence interference, well contamination, and boundary violation compiled by Rosa Whitfield and Benjamin Ashford over the preceding 6 weeks. It was finished by noon. They celebrated that evening with Amos at the kitchen table, with a bottle of rye whiskey that Amos had produced from some personal reserve and which was very good, and they ate beef stew and corn bread and talked about the east field, which was showing excellent growth, and about the roof of the barn, which was now fully sound, and about the cattle, which had increased by 6 head with the spring calves, and which were doing well. Amos looked at Benjamin over his whiskey glass with the expression of a man who has had certain opinions for some time and has been waiting for the appropriate moment to voice them. "You staying on then?" he said. "I expect so," Benjamin said. "Good," Amos said. "My hip's getting worse and somebody has to handle the north fence before winter." Rosa laughed, and it was the full laugh, unguarded and easy, and Benjamin looked at her across the table in the warm lamplight of the kitchen and felt something vast and simple, the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, which he had not felt before in any specific place and had begun to wonder if he was capable of. He proposed in the first week of July, which felt to both of them like the right time, not so fast that it wasn't real and not so slow that it was cautious, because neither of them was interested in being cautious about something this clear. He didn't have a ring to give her, which he told her with a directness that she appreciated, and he said he'd get one in Wichita when they went in for supplies the following week. She said the ring was beside the point, and she'd like to tell him her answer now, if that was acceptable, because she wasn't the kind of person who made someone wait for something they were going to say yes to. She said yes in the kitchen on a Sunday morning with the coffee on the stove, and the sun coming through the east window and making patterns on the floor, and he put both hands on her face and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she wrapped both arms around him and held on for a long time, not in distress, but in the way a person holds something they are deliberately, fully, claiming. They were married on the 4th of August, 1878, in Caldwell, in the small Methodist church at the end of 2nd Street, with Amos standing up for Benjamin and a woman named Clara Hinds, who was Rosa's nearest neighbor and closest friend, and who had driven 4 miles in a good dress to be there, standing up for Rosa. The minister was a young man named Reverend Fisk, who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, and at the moment when Benjamin put the ring on Rosa's finger, a plain gold band purchased in Wichita in a shop that smelled of beeswax and cedar and looked at her face, he felt the old architecture of his independence, which he'd built so carefully and kept so clean, give way not to loss but to something of an entirely different structure. Something he'd had no blueprints for, and which turned out to be considerably stronger. They had 12 people at a supper on Clara Hinds' back porch afterward, with food that half of them had brought and music from a fiddle player named George who'd been hired for the occasion and who played until well after dark. And Rosa danced in Benjamin's arms under the Kansas stars with her head against his shoulder and his hand spread across her back. And the night was warm, and the music was good, and the field to the east was going to give an excellent yield in September. The fall harvest was everything Rosa had calculated it would be. The east field came in strong, the corn heavy and sound, and with what they made at market in September plus the restoration funds from Callaway's judgment, Rosa was able to retain Marcus Porter, the Wichita lawyer Aldridge had originally mentioned, to handle the full legal cleanup of the Whitfield property title. Porter was everything Aldridge was and then some, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a way of reading a room that came from 20 years of territory law, and he spent 3 weeks in October going through the Whitfield property records with a fine comb, and emerged with a clear, certified, unchallenged title that named Rosa Whitfield Ashford as sole owner of the 320 acres, deed recorded, no encumbrances. He brought the document out to the property to deliver it personally, which was unusual, but Porter said he liked to see what he was protecting, and he walked the fence line with Benjamin and asked intelligent questions about the land and the operation, and then he stood by the north corner post that Benjamin had reset in April and looked out at the property and said, "This is good land, well managed." "It is," Benjamin said. "You two have plans to expand." "We're thinking about the adjacent 40 acres to the west," Benjamin said. "The family there wants to move to Colorado. We'd have right of first offer." Porter nodded slowly. "That's a sound plan." "You'd need a note for it unless you've got the cash." "We'd need a note," Benjamin said. "I have a relationship with the bank in Wichita. Clean credit. He'd spent 20 years building clean credit through careful, deliberate management of his finances, and it was, he reflected, the first time he'd ever been glad of it for a reason that included someone else. Rosa was on the porch when they came back from the fence line, and she had coffee and pie, and she listened to Porter's summary of the legal status of everything with the focused attention she brought to all business matters, asking two precise questions that Porter answered with visible respect. And when he left in the late afternoon, she stood in the doorway of the farmhouse holding the certified deed in both hands. "It's done," she said. "Done," Benjamin confirmed. She looked at the deed for a long moment, and then she looked at him, and her expression was the full complicated thing, satisfaction and relief and grief for the years it had taken to get here and something forward-looking that was not grief at all. And he crossed the porch and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him. And they stood there for a while in the October afternoon, with the trees turning along the creek line, and the smoke beginning to come up from the chimney, where Amos had started the kitchen stove on his way out. Calloway, in the end, was fined significantly for the fraudulent documentation and the sustained interference, and two of his creditors, spooked by the legal trouble and his diminished reputation, called in loans simultaneously in November, which put him in a position that required selling two of his outlying sections to cover the calls. One of the sections sold to a farming family from Iowa named Tremblay, who arrived in December with two grown sons and a covered wagon full of equipment, and proceeded to be excellent neighbors. The other section went to a cattle outfit out of Texas that had a permanent foreman on site and no interest in acquiring anything beyond their purchase. Calloway himself moved to Wichita in January of 1879, and nobody in Caldwell was particularly sorry to see him go. Prout, who had managed his realignment with sufficient grace that he hadn't been removed from his position, spent the better part of the following year being scrupulously correct in his official dealings, which was all anyone had ever asked of him. Benjamin passed him on the street occasionally, and they exchanged the neutral acknowledgement of men who understand each other's positions and have no remaining quarrel. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was cold and long, which Kansas winters tended to be, and the farmhouse was warm because the stove was good and the insulation in the walls, which Benjamin had improved in October by packing additional material into the gaps he'd found in the external walls, held the heat well. They spent the evenings in the lamplight, Rosa reading and sometimes writing letters, Benjamin working on the accounts or making repairs to equipment that could be done indoors. And sometimes they talked for a long time about things that weren't the farm at all, about books they'd both read and hadn't expected to have read in common, about the territory and what it would look like in 10 years, about what the railroad coming through south of Caldwell was going to mean for markets. Rosa was 3 months pregnant by Christmas, which they had suspected for about 6 weeks and confirmed when she went to the doctor in Caldwell on the 17th of December. She received the news with the same composed practicality she received most things, and then on the drive home, she reached over and put her hand on Benjamin's arm and held it, and he covered her hand with his, and they drove the 3 miles back from town without needing to say very much about it, because the feeling of it was doing all the necessary work. She told Amos the next morning, and he responded by producing a carved wooden toy horse from somewhere, which had apparently been in his coat pocket for 3 months. He said he'd seen it in a Wichita shop in September and bought it because he'd had a feeling, and Rosa hugged him, which he accepted with the dignified pleasure of a man who is not used to being hugged and is in favor of it. Clara Hinds came for Christmas dinner and brought her husband, a quiet, kind man named Eli who had the gift of listening well, and they ate and talked, and the snow came down outside the kitchen windows, and the farmhouse was full of warmth and sound. Benjamin looked around that table and felt, with the specific gravity of a man who has spent a long time traveling light, the weight of something real and permanent, and it was not a burden. It was the opposite of a burden. It was what a burden is not. The spring of 1879 came in gentle and then hard, which was usual for Kansas, with a warm March that tricked everything into optimism, and then a cold snap in early April that tested everything it had warmed up. The East Field went in on schedule. The 40 acres to the west had been purchased in February through the banknote Benjamin had negotiated in January, and it gave them a total acreage of 360 acres, which was, as Rosa said in the precise accountant's voice she used for things that pleased her especially, a very respectable operation for their particular circumstances. Amos brought his nephew in to help with the spring work, a young man named Will who was 17 and built like a draft horse, and who learned things very quickly and worked very hard, and who was clearly going to be a good man when the very young part of him finished sorting itself out. They paid Will a fair daily wage, and he was grateful for it, and showed his gratitude through the best possible means, which was working extremely hard and asking good questions. Benjamin's son was born on the 17th of June, 1879, which was a hot and brilliant Kansas day, and he was born in the farmhouse with the assistance of Dr. Carver from Caldwell and Clara Hinds, who arrived at 4 in the morning when Benjamin rode for her through the dark, and who stayed through the birth and for several hours after. Rosa's labor was long and not easy, and Benjamin spent most of it in a state of controlled anxiety that expressed itself as absolute stillness, sitting in the kitchen with his hands clasped and his head bowed, listening to the sounds from the back room and trusting Clara and the doctor, and also, somewhat to his own surprise, praying, which he had not done in a long time. When Dr. Carver opened the door and said, "You have a healthy son, Mr. Ashford, and your wife is doing well," Benjamin stood up from the kitchen chair and pressed his hands against his face and breathed, and the relief moved through him like water. He was allowed in after a few minutes, and Rosa was propped against the pillows looking exhausted in a specific and radiant way, the way a person looks when they have done something very hard and come through it, and she was holding a small red-faced bundle that was making sounds like someone who had opinions about his new situation and was not planning to keep them to himself. "He's very loud," Rosa said, as Benjamin came to the bedside and sat beside her. "That's good," Benjamin said, and his voice was not entirely steady. She leaned against his shoulder and he looked at his son's face, and the face looked back at him with the unfocused, serious gaze of a creature who has arrived very recently and is still taking inventory. And Benjamin felt something happen in his chest that he could not have described with any word he already knew. They named him Henry James Ashford. Henry for Rosa's father, the doctor, James for Benjamin's grandfather, and Henry James Ashford came home to the farmhouse on the Whitfield land, and was installed in the crib that Benjamin had built in March from good pine, with carved corner posts that were very slightly decorative, which was the extent of Benjamin's carpentry vanity. Amos met Henry James Ashford 2 days after the birth, when he came to the house with a pot of soup he'd made, and which was considerably better than you'd expect from a man who lived alone, and he held the baby with the careful ease of a man who had held babies before, and the baby looked at him with the same serious inventory expression, and Amos said, "He's got your eyes, Rosa, and his father's disposition." And since the baby's disposition at that moment was notably calm, it was taken as a compliment. Will stopped by that same afternoon with a wrapped bundle that turned out to be a knitted blanket, very neatly done, in blue and white, and when Benjamin raised an eyebrow at it, Will said, with 17-year-old dignity, that his mother had made it and given it to him to bring, which was probably mostly true. Summer deepened, and the East Field and the new West Field both came in good, better than the previous year because the additional acreage gave them room to rotate, which improved the soil performance, which was something Rosa had known theoretically and was gratified to see demonstrated practically. The cattle herd grew. Benjamin hired Will on for the full season, and Will proved out every expectation, and by autumn, he was handling the North Fence quarter independently, which freed Benjamin for the heavier equipment work and the market runs. Caldwell itself was changing in the way that cattle towns on the Kansas border were changing in those years, the rougher edge of the cattle drive economy giving way to the more settled character of an established community. New businesses opened. A second church was built. The school expanded. The constant violence that had characterized the trail towns further south was less prevalent here, though it was not absent, and there were nights when the sounds from the saloon district at the end of the main street were considerable. Benjamin and Rosa had no particular quarrel with the nature of the town, because they were 3 miles from it and had enough of their own business to attend to. But they went in regularly for supplies and church, and for the social connections that Rosa managed with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, maintaining the relationships that were useful and warm and letting the others remain at a neighborly distance. Clara Hinds became something essential to Rosa's life in the way that very good friendships become essential when you are building something, a constant, a true thing to return to when the business of the day had been taxing. They visited twice a week, alternating houses, and Benjamin liked Eli Hinds very much, a man who farmed well and read widely, and had a considered opinion on most things and a genuine interest in other people's opinions, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. The circuit judge's regular sessions in Wichita had shifted to quarterly, which meant more accessible recourse for the sort of ongoing property and contract disputes that were the daily weather of territory life. And Rosa had begun attending the sessions not as a litigant but as an observer, because she'd found that she understood the legal processes better than she'd expected and found them genuinely interesting. Benjamin watched her in these sessions, sitting very upright in the gallery with her notebook, taking down observations in the small, neat handwriting she developed to spare her fingers, and he thought with some wonder about who she was becoming, which was not the same as who she'd been when he'd arrived in Caldwell, but was a deepening of it, the same essential person with more room to be herself. He thought the same thing was probably true of him, that the man he'd been riding into Caldwell in April of 1878, with his saddlebag, and his specific intentions had been right about some things and wrong about others in ways that turned out to matter enormously, and that the man who sat in this courthouse gallery beside his wife was the better version. Henry grew with the particular velocity of small children, which is to say that he seemed to double in personality and capability every few months, while the physical growth proceeded at the more measured pace of something that takes a long time to be fully itself. By his first birthday, he was walking with the determined instability of someone who has recently concluded that upright mobility is mandatory and is adjusting to the technical challenges, and he had a set of opinions about everything, which he expressed with considerable force and limited vocabulary. He was fascinated by the horses. Benjamin spent hours in the first year taking Henry to the stable and holding him up to see the horses' faces, and the horses, who were sensible animals, tolerated this with the patient generosity of creatures who understand when something small is not a threat. Rosa's roan mare, which was by this point 7 years old and of excellent disposition, became Henry's particular favorite, and she would lower her head when he approached, which he found immensely satisfying. The second pregnancy came in the early winter of 1880, and Rosa handled it with the same composed practicality as the first, though she was quicker this time to slow down when she was tired, having made certain adjustments to her theory of personal endurance based on the data of the previous experience. Benjamin, for his part, was attentive in a way that did not crowd her, which was a balance she appreciated, and he had worked to get right. By this point they had taken on a second hired hand, a man named Pete who was in his late 20s and had come up from Texas with the cattle drives and decided to stop moving, which was a decision Benjamin understood. Pete was reliable and skilled with animals, and had a philosophical calm about most situations that made him easy to work with. And he and Will had developed the efficient co-working relationship of people who trust each other's judgment and don't feel the need to talk about it excessively. Amos's hip had gotten worse through the winter of 1880, and in March he came to the farmhouse and sat at the kitchen table and said, with the dignified honesty of a proud man stating an unwelcome fact, that he was not going to be able to continue the kind of work he'd been doing, that his hip had reached the point where a day's physical labor cost him 2 days of recovery, and that he thought it was time to make some adjustments. Rosa listened to this without interrupting, and then she said, "I'd like to talk to you about something I've been thinking about for a while." She poured him more coffee. "There's a small house on the west section, the one we acquired from the Trestle family last year. It's sound and it's empty and it's close enough to the main property that you'd be a neighbor rather than a laborer. And there's a role here that nobody's doing well yet, which is keeping the accounts and handling correspondence, and you're better at numbers than you let on." Amos looked at her. "How do you know I'm good at numbers?" "Because in 2 years of working beside you I've never seen you miscalculate anything," she said. "Not a fence length, not a feed amount, not a wage, not once." He was quiet for a long moment. "The house on the west section," he said. "With a salary that reflects that you're doing skilled work," she said. "Not charity." He looked at Benjamin, who nodded once simply. Amos moved into the house on the west section in April of 1880, and the accounts were never more accurately kept than after that point, because Amos turned out to be extraordinary with numbers, which was a talent he'd had all his life and had never had occasion to use in the right context. Rosa's second child was born in August of 1880, a girl this time, quick and determined from her first hours, and they named her Eleanor Rose. Eleanor for Benjamin's mother, whose name he'd never given to anyone before, and Rose for the shortening of Rosa that nobody called her because she was very specifically Rosa, but which felt right as a middle name that connected the generations. Henry, who was 14 months old at Eleanor's arrival, was initially uncertain about this new development and expressed his uncertainty through several days of pointed behavior, and then abruptly decided that Eleanor was interesting and took up a position of proprietary older brother attention that Eleanor, even in her first weeks, seemed to find somewhat presumptuous, which suggested she was going to be very much her mother's daughter. The years from 1879 to 1882 were the years of building, the steady accumulation of a life that was more than the sum of its practical components. The farm grew. The cattle herd reached 80 head and was managed with the care that comes from understanding that the land has a limit, and that exceeding it is a loan you're taking from the future. The fields produced well, because Rosa rotated them correctly and rested them when they needed it, and didn't succumb to the short-term temptation of overcropping that ruined a great deal of good Kansas land in those years. Benjamin had become, over those years, the person who fixed what needed fixing and anticipated what needed anticipating, and who had the specific satisfaction of a man whose skills are well used in a place where they matter. He was not a man who needed to be seen doing things, which was useful because a great deal of the work that kept the farm functioning was invisible, and he'd come to understand that the invisibility of that work was itself a form of freedom. A freedom from the need for acknowledgement that he found more genuinely liberating than the empty freedom he'd ridden west to find. He and Rosa had arguments sometimes, because they were both people with strong opinions and the intellectual honesty to express them, and their arguments were the good kind. The kind where both people are actually trying to figure out what's right rather than trying to win, and where the resolution usually involved one of them being persuaded by the other's reasoning and saying so, which is the only outcome of an argument that doesn't leave damage behind. They argued about whether to take the bank note for a fourth property section, which Benjamin thought was too much exposure given current cattle prices, and Rosa thought was a sound investment given the rate at which good land was being acquired by large operations. And Rosa turned out to be correct, because the family that owned the North Quarter sold it to a Wichita cattle company in the summer of 1881 at a price that would have been unavailable a year later. And if they'd been in a position to offer the note, they'd have had a property that doubled their acreage. They argued about the school question, which was whether Henry should be enrolled in the Caldwell school at the usual age or taught at home by Rosa. And Benjamin thought the school was good and getting better, and Henry needed the company of other children, and Rosa agreed, but wanted to supplement. And they reached a compromise that turned out to be the right answer for Henry specifically, who was capable and somewhat solitary by nature and benefited from being both schooled and stretched. Clara Hind's youngest son, a boy named Sam who was 6 months older than Henry, became Henry's closest friend through the school years, and the two of them spent the weekends of the early 1880s in the particular companionship of boys who are interested in everything and afraid of very little, ranging the creek bottoms and the low hills of the county, with the freedom that comes from parents who are attentive without being anxious. On a clear September evening in 1882, Benjamin sat on the porch of the farmhouse and looked out at the land in the last light, the west section stretching away to the fence line, the south pasture full of cattle moving slowly toward the water trough, the cottonwoods along the creek going gold and red with the early autumn, and the farmhouse at his back where he could hear Rosa putting the children to bed, her voice patient and warm, Alina asking questions, Henry already quiet. He thought about the morning in April of 1878 when he'd ridden into Caldwell with nothing in his saddlebag but necessity, and nothing in his mind but the specific and principled intention of a man who has decided that freedom is the same as owing nothing. He thought about the skillet and the red-haired woman and the mud-splashed street and the conversation on the mercantile boardwalk, and he thought about the fence and the documentation log and the courthouse in Wichita and the creek in the evening light. He had come to the territory with nothing owed and nothing expected. She had changed both conditions before the month was out, and he had been fighting it for about a week, and then had stopped fighting it because the only thing more foolish than a principled man is a principled man who has met the right person and is still being principled about it. Rosa came out of the house when the children were settled and sat beside him in the second porch chair, the one he'd built the previous winter from a design she'd sketched, and she had coffee in both hands the way she always did in the evenings, and she looked at the land in the last light the way she always looked at it, with proprietary love and accountant's attention happening simultaneously in her hazel eyes. Henry asked me today what it was like when we first came here, she said. What did you tell him? I told him it was difficult for a while and then it got better. She paused. I left out some of the middle parts. He'll ask again when he's older, Benjamin said. He will, she agreed. And then I'll tell him about the fence, she smiled. And the skillet. Benjamin laughed and she laughed, and the evening was warm for September and the land was good and quiet. Are you happy? She asked. Not with doubt in it, with the genuine curiosity of a person who asks because the answer matters, not because they need reassurance. Benjamin looked at her in the evening light. He thought about the word happy, which he'd never had a very precise relationship with, and whether it was the right word for the particular thing he felt, which was something larger and quieter than happiness and more durable, the feeling of a man who has found the place where his life makes sense. Yes, he said. Very. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat as the light finished going, and the first stars came out over Kansas, which in September made the kind of sky that has no business being as beautiful as it is, dark and wide and full of fire, and the cattle settled in the south pasture, and the cottonwoods rustled, and the farmhouse behind them held the warm light of the lamp in the parlor where the children were sleeping. The years kept going, as years will. Henry Ashford started at the Caldwell School in the fall of 1882, already able to read and do arithmetic to a level that surprised his teacher, Mrs. Hartfield, who was a woman of considerable educational standards, and expressed her surprise by simply demanding more from him, which he responded to with the focused diligence of someone who has inherited his mother's relationship to tasks. He was a serious, kind boy, with a quiet humor that showed up at unexpected moments, and a fierce loyalty to the people he decided mattered to him, which was a small and very specific group. Eleanor, who had begun to walk at 10 months and to talk at 12 with a comprehensiveness that suggested she'd simply been waiting until she had enough words to say everything she intended to say, was by 1882 an eruption of personality in a small package, curious about everything, frightened of nothing, and possessed of an opinion on every subject she'd encountered, which by age 2 was already a considerable number. She followed Benjamin everywhere on the farm with the single-minded purposefulness of a small shadow, asking questions at a rate that was genuinely impressive, and he answered all of them seriously, which she responded to with the serious engagement of a child who has been respected and knows it. Amos, from his house on the west section, had become the quiet center of the property's organizational life, his account books precise and comprehensive, his memory for detail exact, and his presence at the kitchen table for Sunday dinners, a constant that everyone organized around. He was 63 in 1882, and his hip was what it was, but he was otherwise in good health and in better spirits than he'd been in years, and he'd taken to gardening beside the West House with a devotion that produced vegetables of a quality that nobody had expected from a man who'd spent most of his working life outdoors with cattle. Clara and Eli Hines remained the closest of neighbors, and the relationship between the two families had become so woven into the daily fabric of life that a week without seeing them felt incomplete. Eli died in the spring of 1883, quietly in his sleep, which was the best kind of death and also the kind that surprises you most when it comes. And Rosa and Benjamin were with Clara through those weeks with the specific, practical love that does not try to fix the unfixable, but stays present and useful in the ways that can be managed. Clara carried the loss with the dignity of a woman who has loved well and is now learning to carry what comes after love. And by summer, she was herself again, or the self that comes after grief, which is not less but is different. The railroad came to a junction 12 miles south of Caldwell in the spring of 1883, and what Rosa had foreseen 3 years earlier about its effect on markets came true with the precise timing of a well-considered prediction. Cattle prices at the Caldwell market improved significantly because the transport costs dropped, and the Ashford operation, which was now running 110 head on 360 acres, managed with careful rotational practice, was in an excellent position to take advantage of the improved market conditions. They sold 80 head in September of 1883 at a price that Benjamin said was the best he'd seen, and Rosa agreed, and they paid off the last of the bank note on the west section with part of the proceeds, and invested the remainder in the equipment upgrade they'd been planning for the North Field, a new plow setup that would allow them to break additional acreage without the back labor that had been the limiting factor. Will, who was 22 by this point, had left the Ashford operation the previous spring to take a lease on a small piece of land 15 miles northeast, which he'd been saving toward for 2 years, and which he'd purchased with the specific determined thrift of a young man who has absorbed, by proximity, certain lessons about what it means to own the ground you stand on. Benjamin had helped him draft the lease terms, and Rosa had reviewed the associated paperwork, and Will had ridden out in March of 1882 on a good horse, which had been a gift from both of them, and come back in October to show them his first harvest, which was modest and sound, and the beginning of something good. Pete stayed on and had become by 1883 as much a part of the operation as anyone, reliable and skilled and steady, and they'd increased his salary twice, and he'd taken his meals at the kitchen table 4 evenings a week as a matter of established practice. In the late autumn of 1883, Rosa told Benjamin she was pregnant again. He was fixing the hinges on the barn door when she came out to tell him, and she said it with the same particular composure she brought to significant information, watching his face for his reaction the way she always watched for reactions, reading people with the attentiveness that was one of her fundamental characteristics. He set down the screwdriver and looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the distance between them and put his arms around her and held her for a long time in the cold November air, and she held him back. "3," he said into her hair. "3," she confirmed, and the warmth in her voice was everything. The third child was born in July of 1884, a boy they named Daniel, and he arrived with considerably less drama than his older siblings, a fact that the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Bauer who had replaced Dr. Carver in Caldwell's medical practice, with the assistance of a certificate from a Kansas City nursing school, attributed to experience and said so in a matter-of-fact way that Rosa found accurate and pleasant. Henry, who was 5, took the arrival of a second brother with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has already adjusted to the reality of siblings, and has concluded that the important thing is the trajectory rather than the immediate inconvenience. Eleanor, who was 4, had the reaction of a person who had expected another girl, and is being reasonable about her disappointment while also being completely clear about the disappointment, and within a week had decided that Daniel was satisfactory on his own terms and proceeded to inform him, at length, about the nature of the world as she understood it, which was a great deal. Daniel grew up in a household that was, by 1884, a settled and complete thing, a working farm that was also a home, managed by 2 people who were genuinely in partnership in the fullest sense of the word, who disagreed productively and agreed with the satisfaction of 2 minds arriving at the same place by slightly different routes, who loved each other in the way that deep familiarity builds love rather than eroding it, with more texture and specificity and certainty than the beginning of anything can provide. Benjamin, at 32 in 1884, was a man who was exactly what he was and comfortable with it, which is rarer than it should be. He had the hands of a man who worked outdoors and the mind of one who read seriously and thought carefully, and he had the specific quality of presence that comes from a person who is not trying to be anywhere other than where he is. Rosa, at 30 in 1884, was a woman who had taken everything the world had given her, the losses and the injustices and the difficulties and the beauties, and had made something comprehensive of it. She was the kind of person who gets better as she goes, who has more capacity at 30 than at 24, more patience with what matters and less patience with what doesn't, more precision in what she loves and more generosity in how she loves it. She had also, in 1884, begun working formally with the circuit court system in Wichita, not as a lawyer, which required a license she did not have, but as a legal document preparer, a role she'd been doing informally for neighbors for 2 years, and which the court system had formally recognized as a useful service. She rode to Wichita twice a month and sat in the clerk's office and helped people who were navigating legal processes they didn't understand complete the paperwork they needed, and she was extraordinarily good at it, and she charged a modest fee and kept a separate account for the income, which was her own. Benjamin was unreservedly proud of this. In the specific way he was proud of all the things she did, which was the pride of someone who genuinely enjoys watching an excellent person be excellent, without any of the complicated performance that accompanies pride when it's about the person doing the feeling rather than the person being observed. Clara Hinz remarried in the spring of 1885, a widowed farmer from 2 townships over named Arthur Webb, who was 60 years old and gentle and good, and who looked at Clara with the specific reverence of a man who has found something he didn't expect to find again. And Rosa cried at the wedding in the Methodist church and held Benjamin's hand, and said afterward that it was the most hopeful thing she'd seen in a long time. Henry was 7 in the summer of 1885, and had discovered that he loved history, which he pursued at the school and then at home with the same dedicated appetite, reading everything Mrs. Hartfield could supply, and then the books from the small lending library that the Methodist Church had established, and asking Benjamin and Rosa and Amos questions about the past with the specific focused curiosity of someone building a framework for understanding the present. He asked Benjamin one evening about why they'd come to Kansas, and Benjamin told him the honest version, which included the part about riding west with nothing in particular and meeting Rosa in the middle of a road dispute, and Henry listened with his head slightly tilted, the way Rosa tilted her head, and then said, "Was she angry when you met her?" "She was in the middle of proving a point," Benjamin said. "There's a distinction." Henry considered this. "But you stayed." "I stayed," Benjamin agreed. "Because of her." Benjamin thought about it. "Because of the fence that needed mending," he said. "And then because of her." Henry thought about this for a long time. "That seems like an important order," he said with 7-year-old seriousness. "It was," Benjamin agreed. Rosa, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway with the coffee she'd come to deliver, caught Benjamin's eye over Henry's head, and the look between them was full of everything. The April mud and the creek in the evening light, and the courthouse steps, and the lamplight kitchen, and the 3 children and the years of it. The whole comprehensive thing they had made of 2 lives that had started in the same Missouri weather without knowing each other, and had found their way across Kansas to this porch, this land, this evening. She brought him the coffee, and he took it, and she sat beside him, and Henry drifted off to find a leaner and leave the adults to their adult quiet, and the evening settled around them like something known and loved, specific in its details and large in its meaning. The land was good. The crops were in. The cattle were sound on the south pasture. The children were alive and curious and growing with the productive chaos of things that have everything they need. Amos was in his house on the west section with his garden and his account books. Pete was in the bunkhouse. The stars were coming out over Kansas in the particular extravagance they reserved for September. Rosa leaned her shoulder against Benjamin's, and he turned his head to look at her, and she was looking at the land with her accountant's proprietary love, and then she turned to look at him with the other thing, the thing that had no name except the full weight of 4 years of daily life and daily choice and daily love, which is the only love that is really real, the love you have to keep choosing. He had come to the territory with nothing owed and nothing expected, and she had changed both conditions before the month was out, and the sum of those conditions, added up across the years, was this: a woman he loved and who loved him, a farm that worked, children who were growing into themselves, and the particular knowledge of a man who has found out, through the direct and specific evidence of his own life, that what he had been afraid of was not the thing itself but the version of it that ends badly. This version had not ended badly. This version was ongoing and warm and full of things worth accounting for. He put his arm around her in the September evening, and she leaned into him, and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas plain until the sky was full of them, and the land below was dark and good, and the farmhouse held its light against the dark the way a good thing holds itself against whatever comes at it, steady and present and enduring. He had built this. They had built this. Out of nothing owed and nothing expected, they had built everything worth having. And in the farmhouse behind them, Daniel, who was 14 months old and had recently discovered walking and found it extremely satisfying, was navigating the kitchen floor with his arms out for balance, watched over by the horse carved by Amos that lived on the kitchen shelf, and by the lamplight, and by the distant sound of his parents' voices on the porch, which was the sound of safety, which was the first sound he had ever known, and which he would carry with him for the rest of his life as the definition of home.